Well, welcome to those of you who joined this session on gender and identity, or sex and personhood. Before I get started, though, I'd just like to take a moment of silent prayer here in the UK. 3 p.m. We're asked to remember in prayer and reflection the soul of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, who's being buried today. So if you could join me in a silent prayer for the repose of his soul and for the grace of consolation for his wife, Queen Elizabeth, and all the family who mourn their loss at the moment. Heavenly Father, we ask you to embrace to your eternal merciful presence and bosom the soul of your son, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who is buried today. We pray for his wife, the Queen, who mourns his loss, and all those who love him. We give you thanks for the life of dedicated service you gave to the UK and the Commonwealth, and that we ask you to bring him to your eternal presence, forgive his sins, and may his witness be an inspiration to others, both in public service and his commitment to marriage. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. May he rest in peace. Amen. Well, I wonder if we could just very quickly invite people who are here just to say who you are, where you're from, just quickly, if you want to type in your name and say where you're from, that would be really good. I'm coming to you here from very sunny, I've had to shut the blind, actually, it's too bright for the camera, very sunny Surrey in England, south of London, beautiful sunny afternoon here in the UK. And I hope that wherever you are from, you've had a good start to your day, you've been enjoying the sessions so far, and we can share some insights in the next 15 minutes or so about this really, really important topic of sex and personhood, gender and identity. So welcome to you all. I can see your names coming up there. Thanks for that. It's great to have you. I'm going to share my screen with you. I've done a PowerPoint presentation, so hopefully this will work, and I'll take you through some insights that I've been looking at over many years, actually, not just in preparation for this talk. But I think it goes without saying that the whole business of gender identity, gender identity dysphoria, as it's often called, or is called, or transgenderism, is undoubtedly an ideology. And I think we must never be afraid or scared of using that term. I mean, it's when you look at things like this, which I came across several years ago now, which, as you can see there, is a planned professional development training for teachers. In fact, this was sent to me from Canada some years ago now, and you can see the many different acronyms there for the different types of sexual orientation and personal identity, and the list goes on. It's even longer than that these days. It's very hard to argue with the fact that this is clearly ideologically driven. And when we think about what defines an ideology, and I came across this recently, which I think is, rather amusing, but actually true. The ideology is it can take on an almost cult-like identity, an almost cult-like compulsion upon those driven by it and for its aims. And I don't think we're alone in this language. We know we're not. Pope Francis has used this idea of ideological colonization, which has taken place over several years now, especially in the realm of education and the formation of young people when it comes to introducing to them, or indeed I would say imposing upon them in some cases, this notion that they can choose their sex, that they can begin to believe, particularly if they're feeling vulnerable and uncertain in their tender years, and particularly in adolescent years, they can begin to believe that they really are born in the wrong body. And we've seen how widespread that can become, and how terribly difficult it is to stay on track of it all, both in terms of what's going on in the field of education, and that's my professional field and background, but also what's going on in government policy. All the time, the changes that are going on there in terms of legislation and social and government policy, and particularly in the West and the Northern Hemisphere. And I might just mention, you may, if you get a chance, if you haven't seen it already, there was a very interesting statement released last week. I think it was end of March, sorry, by Cardinal Dolan on the Equality Act in the US, which is not totally different from the equality legislation we've had here in the impact that has on religious freedom, freedom of belief, and in particular, what's going to be expected in public institutions around this whole business of gender identity and gender ideology. So his statement reads very well. It's worth going to. But an absolutely go-to place, and I'm sure you've got equivalent types of web resources and websites where you come from, but the go-to place I found absolutely fantastic in the last 5 or 6 years has been this website called transgendertrend.com. It's an organization of people from all different types of professional backgrounds and walks of life, parents, physicians, therapists, psychotherapists, educators, etc., you name it, who come together really to try and pool as many resources as they can from a widespread field of disciplines to keep people up to date on the type of issues and problems that are going on for young people. So I do highly recommend that site. It's in no way religious whatsoever. In fact, I'd be honest and say there are elements of that which might be abrasive to the Catholic conscience, but nevertheless, it is replete with some really, really good and helpful resources. One of those is a book that was published by them in the early days called Transgender Children and Young People. One of the authors there, Dr. Michelle Moore, who I quote there, gave a very powerful and compelling statement and testimony back in 2018 to a women's rights conference here in the UK. And she talked about this idea of self-identification of gender as a tool that adults can manipulate children with, sometimes in very selfish ways. And she said something quite radical in that it can involve the teaching of the idea that children can change sex, which is a lie embedded in a discourse of changing gender identity. So there's a very, very brave thing to say, and it's getting increasingly difficult to challenge gender ideology and gender identity in the world that we live in. I mean, we are faced with the science of sexual identity. We know that our sexual identity is something that we have from conception, bar the very, very rare exceptions that can happen in pregnancy, etc., with intersex children, which can be clinically and therapeutically addressed early on when identified and diagnosed. So we're faced with this overwhelming global ideology in the face of incontrovertible biological science, and how to challenge it. And that's why Pope Francis feels very strongly, as we know he does, about how we can best serve children and the vulnerable stages that childhood is, and youth and adolescence is, when it comes to learning who you are and what makes you tick, and how you respond to your body, male and female, as you're growing. And he warns about this kind of ideological colonization almost being an experiment on children, as he says there in that clip, that slide there, to warns us against not using children as guinea pigs. So how, as Catholics, can we face this ideological onslaught with the truths that we know, that the doctrines that we believe, when actually just stating truth or just defending our belief of sexual identity, the complementarity of men and women, can be seen as almost like an act of hate. And we know that can be the case. It doesn't take long to get cancelled on Twitter and other social media, like our friend J.K. Rowling's found last year or 2 years ago to her experience. It doesn't take long to get cancelled for just saying something which is, as I say, evidentially true. And as Christians, we've got to stand up and be counted. So where can we go for further inspiration and insights? Well, I think if you're working with young people at all, or in the field of education, or it's something you're interested in, I would encourage you to go to this document from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Catholic Education, which was issued a couple of years ago, Male and Female, He Created Them, where it's calling for this returning, not so much going back to basics, but learning to accompany children and young people and their families with truthful language about sexual difference, and how sexual difference is part of God's plan. As Pope Francis has said in other occasions, we mustn't be afraid of sexual difference. It's a mystery to embrace. It's not a problem to try and solve. From my perspective, as someone who works in education, I've been working with a program called Fertile Heart, which is trying to bring this idea of the beauty of sexual complementarity, sexual difference, to Catholic schools and others, to try and give them a language and equip them with resources that will help them explore with young people why it matters that you're a boy, that you're a girl, why you are not disassociated from your bodily identity, why you're emerging and developing physicality, particularly into adolescence and beyond, is crucially important for helping you understand who you are. And wrapped up in all of that is this entire notion of personhood, that we want you as a young person to appreciate and embrace the absolute inviolability of your unique identity as a person, and that your personhood is all about aspiring to become fulfilled with the personality of Jesus Christ, and, as it were, being comfy in your own skin is a very, very important part of that. So we've been developing the resources for primary schools and secondary schools, or as you say in the States, elementary and high schools, over the last 3 years, to try and help teachers, not necessarily Catholic teachers, but any teachers, to begin to, as I say, articulate some of these truths that children have a right to hear. We've had the backing of some very, very faithful and prominent bishops here in the UK, particularly those who've got an appreciation for and an understanding of theology of the body, and a good grasp of Christian anthropology as the Church teaches it to us. And I think that's going to be the theology of the body, and the catechesis of John Paul II on human love is going to become, hopefully, more and more of a major feature in this kind of educational enterprise. But it's also important to remember that as Christians, we're not alone in this task. The late Lord Chief Rabbi Sachs, Jonathan Sachs, here in the UK, he died sadly of cancer just in last year. He was given a very, very important platform at the Humanum conference at the Vatican back in 2015, and has written extensively about how important it is no matter what people's individual circumstances might be in terms of their sexual orientation or their gender identity, dysphoria, or whatever, caring for them on a personal pastoral level, which is absolutely critical, always and in every circumstance, must never allow us to diffuse the absolute importance of the centrality of the message, of the biblical truth, if you like, of the complementarity of the sexes and the plan that complementarity of sexuality has in God's plan for us. So if you want to learn more about what we're doing, we're having a free webinar on the 28th of April. It will be between 5 and 6 p.m. GMT UK time. So if that's completely, I understand it, wherever you are in the world, if that's just not doable, nevertheless, you can register to be part of that, and you'll be able to see the recorded version at a later date. So I'm just going to leave it there in terms of insights that I can share and have shared with you in terms of just some notions there. And if anyone's got any questions or wants to pop a question there in the chat or an insight based on what I've had time to share, that I'd be more than happy to answer it, and hopefully can address the point you're making. So there's a question here from Letitia. What would you say to children of parents of same sex? This gets complicated. Yeah, it is complicated. Absolutely, it's very complicated. I think what's important is having the personal relationship. So of course, if you're a pastor and if you're a teacher and you're working in the context of a Catholic institution, then it's critical that a relationship of trust is built up and engendered with that family and that household, so that you can begin to have an intelligent conversation about why the church teaches what it teaches, without them feeling judged for their personal circumstances, and that is doable. It's not easy, but it is doable. That's that ambience of inclusion, which of course Pope Francis embodies and personifies to us so well in the way he's dealt with adults struggling with these questions. I think is very important. Where can you get the link to the webinar on the 28th? Well, if you email me, edmund@fertileheart.org.uk, I can send you the link, or you can follow us on Twitter @fertileheart. The links are on there, and it's on our website as well. So it's pretty easily available. I think the links to the groups will be shared with you for sure. This PowerPoint that I've done will be available to the Smart Catholics team, and they'll definitely be able to circulate it to you afterwards. Absolutely no problem whatsoever. Or you can email me, and I'm very happy to give you that information. Father Pascal, good to hear from you. Do you cooperate with the demand for using pronouns? I can't say I've actually been confronted with that one yet. It's an interesting question, isn't it? I think again, I think it would depend on the circumstances, and I think it would depend on the nature of the interaction I'm having with that particular person. I certainly have no issue whatsoever if someone who's male or female wants to be called by a male wants to be called by a female name and vice versa. I don't particularly have an issue with that, because people have nicknames, and even if that feels a bit strange from my perspective, I can roll with that. So at least the person feels comfortable if we're having a dialogue and a conversation, so that they don't feel ostracized from the get-go. And I think that's terribly important advice for parents who've got kids struggling with this issue now, because obviously the parents give their child a name, and if the child no longer wants that name, that's a struggle for parents. But I think by saying, well, kind of think of it in terms of a nickname, so that at least the channels of communication are kept open and are going. Let's see some questions here. When a student comes to you and says, please start calling me a male name, she's a female, and I ask you to do so too, how would you talk to her? Well, hopefully, Alexandra, I've addressed that one for you. Again, I think it's it's just something you have to take one step at a time on a personal basis. Question from Sarah here. Hi, great to see you too, Sarah. Do you have a book to recommend about people claiming to be non-binary? Are there any good texts on the psychology of the struggle? Yes, I think you'll find all of those issues addressed very comprehensively at the transgendertrend.com website. They do regular blogs, they have testimonies from people and clinical professionals, as well as people struggling with the issues. So I'd recommend that there. Albert says, is gender neutral education being taught in Catholic schools in Wales? No, it's not being taught. I would say that because of the government legislation and the expectation placed on Catholic schools, which are state funded here, there's an expectation that children by a certain age, so by mid to late teens, have had the legislation on these issues explained to them, so that they're aware of what the law allows in terms of equality legislation and what they are entitled to in terms of equality and access to services. But when Catholic schools are not required yet to teach gender ideology or gender identity as truths, just like we're not expected to promote abortion or contraception. Catholic schools make pupils aware that these are social realities and they may be legally permitted, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are morally permitted. And Catholic schools for now are allowed to make that distinction when you're talking to children. That you can say, yes, well, that might be legal. It doesn't necessarily mean it's moral. And from the Catholic anthropological perspective, we take a different view in terms of personal identity. So hope that's helpful, Albert. John says, I know someone who has changed sex, female to male. Should I try to challenge them about this? Well, presumably you're talking about an adult. And I would say, no, challenging them is probably not going to be helpful. I think when you're dealing with adults, I think you just have to be a listening ear. And if they approach you with a question and it may be some anger about the church's teaching or whatever, then you kind of absorb that anger and let them vent, and then say, but there's a bigger picture here, and maybe some of your anger, some of your frustration is coming from a deeper place and issues that maybe you haven't addressed. And so kind of sensitively, tentatively suggest that there's another way to look at this, there's another perspective to take. And as I say, the Transgender Trend site has as much information for adults and on issues about gender reassignment and what we used to call sex change operations as it does about gender ideology, education, and transgender organizations. So again, I recommend that to you when dealing with friends or people you know. Letitia asks, does the pronouns use have a moral place, or do we promote this gender war using it? Good question. I personally would resist. Again, it depends on the circumstances, but I would personally try and resist acquiescing to the insistence on calling me she when I'm very obviously a he. But it's about choosing your battles, isn't it, very carefully, and you've got to be careful not to get the wrong side of a company policy, depending what your employer says, etc. Because if you find yourself falling foul of that, you could obviously come unstuck in terms of an employment tribunal. But I do think it's good to remind people that when they're stating their claim about their equality rights on this issue and others, it's good to say, that's fine. I respect your opinion, and I also respect that that's what the law might say. But the law also protects my religious freedom. religion is a protected characteristic in inequality legislation. It certainly is in the UK, and I think it is in other most other countries. Though, you know, the lines get more and more blurred between which rights get more protection than others. But nevertheless, I think I think one can be assertive without being abrasive to say, yes, there are those rights, and amongst them are my rights, my protected rights of belief. And there are numerous cases of very committed Christians and others who've fought these battles and gone right through the courts and won, because actually the law technically is on their side. Social consensus might not be on their side, but the law technically is. So never be afraid to, you know, protect your religious freedom in legal terms, because it is protected. Another question: how does one answer the assertion by same-sex wedded couples that there is nothing wrong with it, since God willed it by creating them gay? Okay, yes, it's the old chestnut, isn't it? You know, love is love, whatever it is, etc. And God made me this way. I don't think it helps to talk about God made me this way. What I found helpful in talking to gay couples or gay people is to say, look, I understand why when the church uses this phrase, what's the phrase? Intrinsically disordered. I understand how that can get your hackles up and make you feel attacked personally, that you feel somehow abnormal or something. First of all, it's important to remember that the phrase intrinsically disordered is a technical, highly technical theological term. So that's the first point. The second point is to say, actually, if you think about it, because of original sin, and we're all wounded but not permanently damaged from that original sin, when it comes to our sexuality, you know, we're all, in a sense, disordered about it. We all have to live with concupiscence. We have to live with unchastity. We have to live, or the temptation to unchastity. We have to live with the propensity for us to want evil and not choosing good. You know, and all of us have got this struggle, and that includes our sexuality. Even if we're married and faithful, or single and faithful, or whatever, priest, ordained, consecrated, religious, whatever our station in life, however deep interior our life in Christ is, we all struggle with this tension. So we all have this, we're all disorientated when it comes to the perfect relationship that we want with God in terms of how we live our sexuality. So yeah, I mean, just answering that question alone, Albert, would be another 30 minutes. But I do think the website truthandloverc.org, which is a website of the Courage International apostolate, gives some very helpful opinions and insightful blogs there about answering that question you've got there about same-sex weddings and same-sex couples. I think our time's just about wrapping up, down into the last 30 seconds here. So thank you very much to all of you who came to listen to me. Hope it didn't feel too rushed, and thank you for your participation and your attention. I hope it's been useful. Please feel free to email the team to get my contact details, or email me anytime. You can follow me on Twitter at Fertile Heart. Happy to keep the conversation going as we go along. God bless you, and thank you all very much.